Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here. I appreciate that warm introduction, Grace. I welcome the opportunity to be able to talk here this morning and speak with folks about the riparian buffer rules because of we're always working in an effort to provide more information and clearer information out there about these rule sets and to help consultants and local governments who have to work with them every day. And so what I'm going to do here in my presentation is actually, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper. I'm going to build off what you've heard from Dr. Birchall and Ms. Homewood so far, and dive a little bit deeper into the actual nuts and bolts of reviewing buffer authorizations and issuing approval for buffer impacts. I want to touch on how the buffer authorizations overlap a little bit with 401s, and also how to submit applications, what to look for when reviewing applications, what DWR will look for, and what local authorities may be looking for in their delegated programs or designated programs. I'm also going to touch on exceptions and variances very briefly to build off a little bit of what Sue discussed. And then lastly, I want to take a quick look, kind of an overview of what rules and what basins and watershed follow which requirements, kind of an overview kind of cheat sheet. So with that, I'll go ahead and start off with, here is my reminder, my disclaimer that anything that you hear talked about today in these presentations, the information backing that up, the rule sets and the application forms, the guidance documents are all available on our website. I recognize that I think I saw Nikki Mayer just put this in the chat in the previous presentation, and just want to just re-emphasize that if you have questions, there's information where you're confused or where to find an application form. This is the place to go. DWR's Riparian Buffer Protection Program webpage. Please bookmark this page. Use it. Let us know if you have questions for it. It's where this outreach workshop material will be hosted in a future date. And so just want to emphasize that if you have questions or if you need information, go here to find your answers. And if you can't find them there, please do reach out and let us know. Now, I want to start here with this flow chart on applying for a buffer authorization from DWR. You know, I recognize that, you know, there's continuing education credits offered for this. I think there's some requirement that unless there is a complicated flow chart on how to review buffer authorizations, that continuing education credit just isn't valid. So I felt obliged to fill that gap and provide a flow chart here. But joking aside, you know, I hope this can be helpful for consultants who are applying for buffer authorizations and also for local governments who are reviewing buffer authorizations. I've had a number of projects myself where I've looked at these projects and reviewed these applications, and sometimes these things can be stopped before they start. In other words, sometimes applications are submitted incorrectly or in areas that are not buffered. And so if we step through this flow chart here briefly, I hope this will be helpful in kind of what to consider and what to review when you're looking at these applications or how to apply. And so if we start up here, I'm going to use my red laser pointer here to outline where I am in the chart. We start here. The first question we need to ask is the project in a buffer basin? As Sue showed on her presentation, there are a number of watersheds in North Carolina to which the riparian buffer protection rules don't apply. And so from a state perspective, from the state rule set or the delegated government's rule set, those don't apply. They're not active in those watersheds. Bear in mind that if we say, no, it's not the buffer basin, always check your local requirements. As Sue pointed out, there are other programs such as a water supply watershed that use the term buffers interchangeably with the term setbacks. And so therefore, there may be a local, quote, buffer that applies to the project that is outside of the state rules. And so just be aware of that. Once we've concluded that, yes, we're actually in a buffer basin, make sure we check the authority for it. The designated and delegated authorities sometimes are different between municipal governments. In other words, sometimes the county has the authority in places. Other time, if it's a town or cities, ETJ, they have the jurisdiction. And then sometimes those differ. There are some cities that are state jurisdiction and the rest of the county is local jurisdiction or vice versa. So remember to check and see who has the authority in the area in which you're working. Once you determine it is state authority, you're in an area where DWR does implement and do the riparian buffer rules. The next question, and this seems like a basic question, but the next question to ask is, are subject water features present? And so this is where things like a stream determination or a buffer determination, it comes into play. So someone who is certified by the state or by the local or works with the local authority and is certified to make applicability calls needs to be the one to determine if subject feature waters are present. This is where the USGS topography maps come into play, the NRCS soil survey maps, and the field work comes into play. And so I'm not going to get too much into that, but just to make sure that there are subject water features that are present. In other words, just because there is a stream on the ground does not necessarily mean it is subject to the buffer rules. It needs to be investigated. It likely would be, but it's not always the case. So once we're in a scenario where, yes, we're in a buffer basin, we've determined it's DWR state authority, there are subject water features present, then the first thing we do is go pull up that subject set of rules and check the categories, check the table of use category for the project. This is things like, is it a greenway? Is it a road crossing? Is it a utility crossing? Is it a playground? And we look in the table of uses specific to that category to find out what allowance they have. And what I mean by allowances is which group are they in the category, or which category are they in for that table of use item? Is it deemed allowable? And we have, with the new rules, save for the Jordan exception, the Jordan rules stayed the same with the 3 categories, which I'll touch on a little bit more in a minute. But with the new rules, we have 4 categories. We have deemed allowable, we have allowable upon authorization, allowable with mitigation upon authorization, and prohibited. And so starting at deemed allowable, if you are deemed allowable, you do not need an authorization certificate from DWR to conduct the activity. You can move forward with the activity, provided that you implement the best management practices and the project is reduced and avoided and minimized to the maximum extent practical. And so those requirements still apply to the project in deemed allowable projects, even if there is not a delegated or state authority who are reviewing the project. Next is allowable upon authorization, allowable upon authorization with, or allowable with mitigation, excuse me, upon authorization. So these are 2 categories that we'll focus on in more detail again in this presentation. But these 2 categories basically mean that the authority has to review. You have got to submit something to the authority, whether it's the state or the local, and they have to review the project and issue an authorization certificate, issue you a piece of paper before the project can take place. And so in these scenarios where we're submitting, it's the time to also ask the question, does the project require a 401 certification? And basically this means that a 401 certification is something issued by the state for any federally permitted or licensed activity that would result in a discharge of dredge or fill material to the surface water. So if you're putting things actually in the stream that would disturb the better bank, or putting in fill and that are replacing a culvert in the stream, those are activities that would trigger a 401 certification. So if your project is one that does trigger a 401 certification and requires a buffer authorization, we can use a pre-construction notification form to submit for authorization. That form's done online and it has a complete buffer section to capture all the buffer impacts. If your project does not require a 401 certification, in other words, the activity is just in the riparian buffers of the stream, but not in the stream itself, then we have a separate form. It's just a straight buffer authorization application form. Be sure to include your mitigation if that's a part of it, but make sure we're using the right form and it'll help these projects be processed quickly and expeditiously from DWR. Lastly, if you are 2 more categories, if you are not, or if you're prohibited, let's start with prohibited. If you're prohibited from the table of use, there's only one way to get authorization for that type of activity, and that is through the variance process. And I'll touch on that in detail in a minute, but basically that's a challenging process to go through in terms of time, and it has to be presented to the EMC in most cases. And again, we'll go into that a little bit more, but these are for extenuating rare circumstances that there's no other way to complete this project without somehow impacting the riparian buffer, and it has to be granted pursuant to a variance. If it's not explicitly prohibited in the table of uses, but it's just not in there, if we're just not in the table of uses, meaning the project contemplates an activity that's not outlined in there, you could get authorization through allowable with exception per O2B 0611. That's the new rule set that sets out this allowable with exception framework. And I'll go over that a little bit more detail in just a minute. So these allowable with exception and variance applications always include a mitigation proposal and are a required component as part of this. Again, I'm going to conclude the slide with a disclaimer that the Jordan rules look different for the categories, the table of use categories. And again, there's no exception process in the Jordan rules. It's just the variance process that was established before the rule change in June of 2020. So that being said, this is an example of what the table of use categories look like in the new rules. Again, we have our deemed allowable, allowable upon authorization, allowable with mitigation upon authorization, and prohibited. And really, the point here is this is how to use the table of uses. We look down the left-hand column to decide where we are or what activity we're doing in the buffer. If the activity is construction of playground equipment or ponds by impounding streams, protection of existing structures. So these are kind of, and as Sue pointed out, it's important to read the whole table of uses just because we want to be sure that we have the right naming convention. In other words, playground equipment is under P for playground equipment instead of R, recreational equipment or some other type of category. So be sure, just familiarize yourself with the appropriate table of uses for your area. And also remember that within each item in the table of uses, there could be different use categories based on how the item is applied. And this is in detail here for this playground equipment item. For example, if you're installing playground equipment on a single family lot that does not involve removal of vegetation, you are deemed allowable. You can move forward. However, if you have to remove vegetation to install it in the buffer, that requires an authority's review and approval. And so just be very careful as you're looking and reading this table of uses. This provides a lot of answers to questions that we get. And so read this table carefully and be familiar with it for your area, the riparian buffer rules. In these categories specifically, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because again, Sue did touch on this, but deemed allowable means it's what the old category of exempt was. But deemed allowable, you still must use best management practices to minimize disturbance for those types of activities, even though you don't have to get a written approval from the authority. Secondly, on allowable upon authorization, you may proceed with the activity, but you've got to get that written authorization from DWR or the local authority. The mitigation is the same as allowable upon authorization, except these necessarily require a mitigation component. And a mitigation piece has got to be included in the application. Rule 15A, NCAC, O2B, 0295 is what outlines the mitigation requirements for each specific watershed. Allowable with exception, these are for activities that are not specifically listed in the table of uses. This is not an explicit table of use category, I'll add, but this are again for activities that are just not listed in the table of uses. They do require hardship demonstration. Lastly, prohibited items cannot proceed for this category unless a variance is granted. So really what I want to focus on is these three types of activities first off, because these are the three activities, or these are the three categories of uses that do require some review and some written concurrence from the division or the authority. So in submitting projects that require buffer authorization, this is just an example, a slide to show exactly how these forms are used. Again, we went back to this piece of the flow chart. If the project does require a 401 certification, the appropriate form to use is the PCN form, the pre-construction notification form. This is an example of what the paper form looks like. We also have an online form, And on that online form, there's a specific buffer section of that online form to put in all the buffer impacts and all the information about the buffer impacts. If you do not have any direct stream or surface water impacts and you do not trigger a 401 review, we have the separate buffer authorization application form to be used. And that is also available in online form. So just a couple notes here. Please be sure if you're applying to submit complete applications. There's no fee from DWR for the review and issuance of buffer authorizations. The 401 certifications and joint 401 buffer projects do carry a fee. Those fees are governed by the 401 rules and the 401 certifications. And so again, the riparian buffer piece is just tacked onto that. There's no additional fee, in other words, for the riparian buffer piece. And so when we submit an application, this is really what we want to look for. If DWR is reviewing this, this is what we're looking for in complete applications. This is what local governments should be looking for in complete applications. And again, this is codified in our new administrative portion of the rule. That's in 02B0611, specifically subsection B1. But first thing, the applications have to have contact and legal information. This includes things like property deed information, agent authorization forms. The application has to include a description of the nature of the activity that they're conducting, including why the impacts cannot be avoided, including a description of avoidance and minimization application to the activity. The application also has to tell us exactly where it is, the location of the activity, the location of the subject water body, the stream information, the surface water classification for the subject water body, et cetera. Map and detail sheets to supporting exhibits to support the application, showing where the riparian buffer impacts are taking place. They have to show the dimensions of any disturbance and the extent of the riparian buffers that are actually on the property. They need to accurately and legibly represent that to conduct a proper review. And as I mentioned before, it needs to include a detailed avoidance and minimization discussion and an explanation why the project can't be reduced or reconfigured to better minimize disturbance to the riparian buffer and protect water quality. The application also has to include any plans for best management practices to control sedimentation runoff or nutrification of the stream while the activity is being conducted or constructed. And then, if applicable, it also has to include a mitigation proposal in compliance with Rule 02B 0295, if that's applicable, if you're in that table of use category, or if you're in a variance or exception framework. And again, this is just that rule citation where all the details of what's included in the mitigation proposal live, so to speak, 02B 0295. And so once we have complete applications and we begin to review them, this is really our main focus, the meat and potatoes of what we want to review when we're looking at applications. The rule procedures, again, for the state rules are set out in 02B 0611. That has actual specific procedures that I'm going to go over here. So that's the rule reference here. In the application, the applicant shall demonstrate three major things. One, that the basic project can't be practically accomplished in a manner that would better minimize disturbance, preserve aquatic life, and protect water quality. Two, the use can't practically be reduced in size or density or reconfigured to better minimize disturbance and protect water quality. And then three, best management practices are used and in place to minimize this disturbance and protect water quality. And generally, or DWR and local governments are charged with reviewing the applications to ensure that these three meat and potato components of the rule are met. And really, the way to summarize these three components are the first component is the avoidance component. In other words, can we get the project done by avoiding impacts? The project cannot practically be accomplished in another manner that would minimize disturbance. Two is the minimization criteria. This is once we know we cannot avoid riparian buffer impacts, have we minimized those impacts to the maximum extent practical? And 3 is known as just the best management condition. Now that we can avoid and we've minimized to the maximum extent practical, are we implementing best management practices to control the activity, particularly during construction, but also through the project lifetime? So how long do we have to do this? So again, in 0611, the rule sets out we have 60 days. DWR and local government has 60 days to review the applications and take action. And those actions that are available to the authorities to take are 3 actions. 1, we can issue an authorization in writing. So we can send back the piece of paper granting an authorization certificate. 2, we can notify the applicant and that we need more information and we can request more information. Or 3, we can deny the request. And so the operative point here, though, is that failure to take any one of these 3 actions within 60 days is considered an issuance of the authorization certificate. And so if we don't act, we are silent in 60 days, that is considered an issuance of authorization and the activity can proceed. And the rule does have a few caveats unless one of the following occurs. The applicant has agreed to a longer time period. The applicant can't furnish or fails to furnish requested information. The applicant refuses to provide access to the site or records that are necessary to complete the review, or that information is otherwise unavailable. Now, specifically, this is more, now that we know kind of how to review the applications, I wanted to just touch on a little bit more kind of actual practical review of buffer authorizations application. And this is not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the things that we work on looking for when we're looking at buffer authorization applications. First of all, are all the streams shown? Is it a complete picture of what's happening on the site? The suggestion is to compare these to the USGS and soil survey maps to make sure that those streams are showing, so there are not impacts that are not that are unintentionally not shown on the application. 2, are the streams where we expect them in the topography? Are they straight lines? Or we don't expect streams to be straight lines unless they're modified. And so therefore, do they show their natural sinuosity as expected? Do impacts for crossings occur at straight segments of streams as a minimization technique? Are there provisions to ensure that stormwater meets the rule criteria? In other words, is stormwater in that dispersed flow? Is the project designed to convert that stormwater into that dispersed flow, or otherwise comply with the rule as far as stormwater management and stormwater management outlets? And then lastly, are all the buffer impacts accounted for? And this is, when we're looking at subdivision, for example, does it include all the utility impacts and the sediment and erosion control measures on the plan? So we know that those aren't going to be proposed at a later time in the riparian buffer. Does it include temporary impacts? There are temporary impacts associated with construction often. And then does it have allowances for your stormwater management outlets? And lastly, of course, mitigation as applicable if the rule requires that, a mitigation proposal. Here's a quick example of a buffer exhibit and kind of what we're looking at. This is an example of an exhibit that I would deem some things are lacking here. I would ask for more information on the exhibit. The first thing that jumps out to me is this is the stream segment here in the middle of the paper, in the middle of this exhibit. The stream segment occurs at a fairly straight line. I have a question about, is this the actual natural stream placement in the topography, or has this been modified? So I would ask questions about that. The second thing I see here is the riparian buffer. We're in the noose as this plan shows. It doesn't show zone 1 and zone 2. It only shows the broad 50-foot riparian buffer, but we don't have the zone impacts. 3, it doesn't show any kind of impacts for this road crossing here. I think the intention here is to show that a road is crossing the riparian buffer, but as presented, I can't tell if there's a buffer that's just not applicable here, or if this is an impacted area. There's no hashing or shading to denote impacts there. Another thing I'm seeing here is I'm wondering about the stormwater management plan. It looks really incomplete in that I see just one stormwater outlet that looks like a curb and gutter outlet here. I'm wondering about the other stormwater management plan and where the other stormwater ponds possibly would discharge. And then lastly, there's lots that look like they will maintain protected riparian buffers. And so that's something that we want to be aware of and be sure that those lots include deed notes on them to show that these lots are applicable to riparian buffers. We prefer that lots are not platted within the riparian buffer for that reason, But if they are shown, we want to ask for more information to ensure that that's covered. Here's an example of a much better exhibit in a buffer authorization. So this exhibit actually, first of all, shows that the stream is sinuous. This is the stream segment here as proposed. This project is also a 401 project, and that is proposed a culvert along the stream that's in that checkered straight line here. But I can tell that the stream, first of all, is sinuous, and the riparian buffer follows along that sinuosity of the stream. It follows the contour of that stream. I can also tell that we're in the Jordan, and it has zone 1 and zone 2 clearly marked and delineated on the map. It also shows the impacts, as I know just from looking at the table of this map that T zone 2 means a temporary impact in zone 2. There are temporary impacts represented by that hashing. This is a temporary impact of zone 1 represented by that hashing. And the rest of these are permanent impacts. This hashing represents permanent impacts to zone 2. And this kind of stars are permanent impacts to zone 1. And so I have a much clearer picture exactly where the permanent and temporary impacts are. In addition, I have a better representation of exactly what activity is occurring on the site so I can complete my avoidance minimization review. Once we've completed that review, we issue an authorization in writing. And just to touch on that real briefly, once we're satisfied with the avoidance, the purpose, the avoidance and minimization, and the best management practices, then we're ready to issue this authorization. Some good best practices for authorities who are issuing this, some that DWR carry forward, are: 1, we have to identify the project number for a file and for reference. 2, we clearly address it to the applicant or the applicant for the buffer authorization, and make it clear for emailing that too. I know COVID, these times, things often go out electronically and physically, and so we want to make sure that we are making it clear how we're communicating this authorization. Also, there's a note here that we should copy the property owner if the applicant is not the property owner. Make sure the property owner knows when there are legal determinations being made that that affect their property. And then another point here is in the subject, we're clearly telling what we're doing. We're giving an authorization certificate per what rules. In this case, it's the NUS 02B 0714. And so we make it clear exactly what we're authorizing there, whether it's an approval, authorization, or denial, or a request for more information. It needs to be clearly stated in the subject or up front. Lastly, there's a project name so we can identify in another level outside of just the DWR or just the ID number, and then an expiration date for the letter. And so once we have, that's kind of the basic information that should be in every letter. And then we have the authority to add conditions to that letter if we determine appropriate. And so as far as the conditions go, well, first off, let me say there should be a buffer impact table that clearly outlines specifically what impacts we're authorizing and specifically what we're not. In other words, this authorization is for zone 1 impacts only. There are no zone 2 impacts. And the first impact, called B1, allows for 150 feet of permanent impact and no temporary impact. The second impact of B2 allows for no permanent impact and some temporary impact. So again, best practices are to include the zeros in this impact table to make sure it's specifically clear whether the authority is authorizing or not authorizing any impacts. And then in addition, we can include whatever conditions are necessary to implement the rules and ensure that the intent of the buffer protection program are preserved. And this includes things like BMPs, mitigation requirements, and restoration of temporarily disturbed areas. Once the authorization is issued, there is an appeal process for the state. That's 60 days. The appeal must be filed within 60 days to the Office of Administrative Hearings. Appeals of local government projects go through their process and then go to the director of DWR. DWR director's decision is appealable also by per appeal to OAH, Office of Administrative Hearings. And again, that must be filed within 60 days. These are outlined in chapter 150B of North Carolina General Statutes and Title 26 of North Carolina Administrative Code. That's where the authority for the appeals procedure lies. Lastly here, or toward the end here, I want to just touch on the allowable with exception category. And so Sue went over this, but I just want to hit a few highlights here in that, look, if these are for activities per the new rules that are not listed in the table of uses, they're meant for really unique and rare situations where there are no other reasonable options. These must meet specific hardships. So the criteria are more stringent than regular buffer authorizations. And again, as Sue pointed out, it's the major exception is for impacts that occur with a third of an acre of impacts or greater in any of the zones. So just a third of any of the 50-foot zones, zone 1 or zone 2, a third of an acre collectively. They require a major exception and a 30-day public notice. And then if you're less than a third of an acre and you're not in the table of uses, that requires a minor exception. And both of these have mitigation components as part of them. And again, they are reviewed and approved by the authority, whether it's DWR or it's the local government. So follow your local ordinances. If you're in a designated or delegated, their ordinance may not be updated. And so they take primacy if they're the delegated program to follow those local ordinances. And then again, just to note, remember, specifically in the Jordan watershed, those rules have not been updated, so they include the old variance process. That means a major variance is in any impact in zone 1 that's prohibited or outside of the table, and a minor variance is in any impact in zone 2 that's prohibited or outside of the table of uses. And those, again, still require approval by the EMC. However, the criteria for those are exactly the same. Yeah, there's the call out to remember that the Jordan process is still a little bit different, still in the quote old. Those rules were relatively new, were not updated in June of 2020. But however, irrespective of whether it's the variance or the exception process, the findings of fact and the criteria apply are exactly the same. We have to check all these boxes, and that first, that there are hardships that prevent compliance with the rule. And what hardships mean is that the applicant can secure no reasonable return from or make reasonable use of the property without this buffer impact. And the rule is specific that it says a greater profit is not considered adequate justification. The rule also mandates that whatever impacts that have to occur are a minimal deviation from the rule. They also require that the hardship is due to the physical nature of the property, that is the topography. The applicant did not cause the hardship by knowingly violating the rule, then asking for an exception, and that the authorization would be consistent with the general spirit, purpose, and intent of the buffer rules. And so we have to review these things. The authority or DWR has to review these things to check all these boxes to determine if the hardship is present to be able to issue an exception. Lastly, on variances, again, these are for prohibited activities, activities that are specifically listed in the rule that are prohibited. Here again is the note about the Jordan rules that were not updated. So make sure you follow whatever rule procedures are in place for your watershed. Jordan again includes the old process that includes major and minor variances, and the major variances still go up to the EMC for review, which is a little bit different than the exception process that's availed to some of the new rule sets. But however, in the new rule sets, if the activity is explicitly prohibited, it only can be authorized by a variance through the EMC. It is pursuant to Rule 02B 0226, and really what it mirrors is a water quality standard variance. So it requires EMC approval, even possibly a public hearing for the variance. And so it's a very stringent procedure to go through that. But just wanted to kind of outline that if the item is prohibited in the table of uses, there still is a process to apply for and request a variance for those. So that's kind of how to review. That's the variance and exception process. And I'll conclude here just with a really quick overview of a comparison table that we'll provide as part of this presentation for folks to use. Really what this shows is the different riparian buffer watersheds, or the different watersheds that have state buffer rules. And it's just a quick reference chart to look at what the purpose of these rules are, who's implementing these, what they apply to, and then the last items are actually where the zones are, what the mitigation requirement is. And so, for example, we can tell The purpose of the Goose Creek watershed riparian buffer rules are to protect the Carolina heel splitter, threatened endangered species. Um, for example, if you go to implementation, we know in the Random watershed, all the local governments implement the rules except for specific activities that are exceptions. And then, for example, applicability. We can look and say the Catawba, the rules only apply to the main stem rivers below Lake James in that basin. So we can tell exactly where the rules apply. So that's just an example of how to use this chart. And the chart's actually continued on this page to give a quick reference to where zone 1 and 2 are in the various watersheds, and then also what mitigation requirements apply to each of the zones. Again, this mitigation requirement, if you don't want to dig into the 0295 rule, 02B, 0295 rule, this is a handy reference chart to kind of show those mitigation ratios. If you have a project that is in the table of use categories that triggers a mitigation requirement, or it's a variance or exception that does trigger a mitigation requirement. So that's a deeper dive down into it. That's a quick overview or lengthy overview possibly, but happy to answer any kind of questions when the time's right here.